Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Bree, president of EarthSave Canada. I'm happy to welcome you back to our virtual speaker series. Today, we are joined by Dr. Jason Hannon. Jason is associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric, Writing, and Communications at the University of Winnipeg, where he teaches some very interesting courses, including the Rhetoric of Animality, which explores the history of Western attitudes towards animals from the ancient world to the present. He is also editor of a book called Meatsplaining, the Animal Agriculture Industry and the Rhetoric of Denial. And this is the topic that he's going to be speaking to us about today. He is also currently working on a book called New White Saviors, The Colonial Politics of Meat, which we all have to look forward to reading at some point soon in the future. And finally, he's the chair of Winnipeg Veg Fest, the largest vegan and animal rights festival in Manitoba. So we're really happy to have Jason as a speaker in our series today. As usual, I will hand it off to him for his talk, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have questions for Jason, please comment them wherever you're watching this, and we will do our best to get to those at the end. And I encourage you to comment and ask questions because we'll be doing a giveaway of 5 copies of his book, Meatsplaining, to people who participate during the talk. And with that, Jason, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bree and Jonathan and Jen for the invitation. To be doing this and really honored to be following in the footsteps of people I really admire, including Carol and Camille. So it's a huge honor. And so before I start, I do just want to say that I just want to acknowledge that we're all probably tuning in, most of us from North America. And in my case, that means that I'm tuning in from Manitoba, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji, Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. Okay, so I'm going to hit the share button and then bring up my screen. Okay, so can you see this?
That's great.
Okay, so the title of my presentation is Meatsplaining, a new name for an old devil, and I'll explain why I'm calling it the old devil. But we'll just get started. What I wanted to do was to open with some examples of meatsplaining. So this is just one. Okay, we've all seen different versions of these different examples. So these are just kind of the most sort of familiar examples that I could find. So this is one example of the kind of thing that my book is about, right? This was a meme that was created in response to the popularity of plant-based burgers, especially the Beyond Burger, which has been, just soaring in popularity in North America and elsewhere. And you can see what's going on here. They list on the left a list of ingredients that are all meant to sound really kind of intimidating and scary. All these kind of, polysyllabic words, which are meant to convey, I don't know, big scary chemicals and that sort of thing. And then on the right, just one ingredient, beef. And the idea is if you're eating the thing on the left, it's very processed, it's not good for you, it's, very foreign, synthetic, and alien, whereas what's on the right is natural, simple, and healthy, right? So the question is, what's going on here? And are there other examples of this kind of message? And so I think you can find lots of them. This is one from the dairy industry, which is doing something very similar. So it's trying to kind of provide a response to the whole dairy is scary kind of campaign. And the idea is that it's not dairy that's scary. In fact, what's really scary is plant milk. So again, big polysyllabic words like calcium carbonate, potassium citrate, and that sort of thing. The idea is that if you're drinking the stuff on the right, you're putting a bunch of, synthetic chemicals into your body. It's unnatural. It's not good for you. It's not healthy. The stuff on the left is simple. It's just milk, one ingredient. It's actually good for you, right? It's an attempt to push back against the popularity of plant-based milks. This is one by Arby's. It's just awful. Arby's has a whole kind of troll marketing campaign against veganism. So this one, friends don't let friends eat tofu, just eat meat. And then there's this one. It's from a website called Protect the Harvest. You can see what's going on here. They basically frame vegans and animal rights activists as extremists. These are names that are used, labels that are used to kind of discredit and denigrate vegans, extremists. Vegans have been called terrorists. This is a very, very kind of common tactic. And this is another one from the Western Gazette called, it's an opinion piece called "My Beef with the Extremist Vegan High Ground." And you can see what their example of extremism is there. It's basically a chalk message called "Cut carrots, not throats." And then another one from a website called, I think it's called Carnivore Aurelius. It's basically a group that promotes an all-carnivore diet. And so it says veganism kills more animals than the carnivore diet. And the idea is that if you really love animals and you really want to help them, you're better off eating animals because then you would be killing fewer of them. And if you're vegan, you're responsible for, an untold number of horrific deaths of animals, right? Okay. So how do we make sense of this all? Is there a pattern connecting all these different examples together? Do they have any kind of core features and characteristics? And can we kind of group them all under one overarching single umbrella? So that was the basic idea and inspiration behind my book, Meatsplaining, subtitled "The Animal Agriculture Industry and the Rhetoric of Denial." So I came up with the idea for this book about, I would say, 5 years ago, actually. It arose through certain experiences that I had had as a speaker, as somebody who was active in, animal rights, in the animal rights movement, as an academic who would speak at conferences. I noticed that there was a certain kind of pattern at these events over and over and over again. Inevitably, there would be this kind of thing, the troll who would say things like, "but bacon" or "bacon." There was this kind of thing, but there was also at more kind of professional conferences, always somebody in the audience who would have to raise their hand, and they had to try to kind of put the speaker's authority in question, to try to sow doubt, to try to undermine their credibility by asking a question like, "Have you ever worked on an animal farm before?" And the idea is, if you say no, then you're just basically kind of discrediting yourself. You're demonstrating, revealing, disclosing that you don't actually know what you're talking about, and therefore you don't have the authority to actually speak about this topic, right? Only an animal farmer knows what's going on, and only the animal farmer has the right to speak. And I found this kind of thing very common, and it was, in my view, a really kind of cheap and dirty tactic. And so it was curious to me that there was this unwillingness to just kind of engage with vegan and animal rights voices on an equal footing, right? There was always this need to try to create this asymmetry and make vegans look like they were the fools, that they were the uneducated ones. And I noticed that, well, what struck me was that there was a parallel between what was going on here and what the feminist writer Rebecca Solnit described in her famous essay, "Men Explain Things to Me." This was the essay in which she introduced the concept of mansplaining into the public lexicon. And so we're all familiar with the concept of mansplaining, but not everyone has necessarily read the essay. But basically what she talks about is her experience at this party where she met the host or some man at this party. And they were talking about he was asking her about some topic. And she mentioned that she was interested in Edward Muybridge, And this host said, "Oh, have you read this book, this new book on Edward Muybridge?" And proceeded to talk about it. And it turns out that she had actually written that book. And it was a bizarre experience to her that this guy was explaining her own book to her, right? So somebody then intervened and said, "Look, she is actually the author of the book." And he didn't know how to even process this information. He couldn't accept that, a woman knew more about this topic than him. So he just proceeded to continue explaining her own book to her as if, he didn't even register that bit of information. It was an extreme act of condescension that just sort of, mansplaining is this way, as she describes it, of, depriving women of a voice and putting them in a place of secondary status, right? And I found something very similar going on in the phenomenon of what I decided to call meatsplaining. So the way I described it in the book was this. I say meatsplaining functions as a silencing mechanism. The extreme condescension and patronizing character of meatsplaining serves to shut down critics of the meat industry, to reduce them to petulant and ignorant children, to eliminate them from the sphere of rational discourse. Meatsplaining delineates discursive boundaries. It establishes who possesses and who lacks the credibility to speak about what happens on animal farms and in slaughterhouses. And then I go on to say, sorry, I just need to move. Here we go. Meatsplaining defines what constitutes the normal, the rational, and the mainstream, and what constitutes the abnormal, the irrational, and the fringe. Those who are effectively boxed into the latter group are by definition lack credibility. If vegans are branded as irrational, violent, and extremist, they will perforce lack the moral standing to speak and be taken seriously. Okay. Okay, so what I do in the book is I identify three primary threats to the animal agriculture industry. And these are the ethical threat, the biomedical threat, and the environmentalist threat. Over the last 10 to 20 years, there has been an explosion of good content, videos and documentaries and books and articles, reports in every single one of these categories, really kind of highlighting just how awful the animal agriculture industry is in its treatment of animals, in its effects, its consequences, its really awful consequences for public health. And then obviously its disastrous consequences for the environment, the deforestation, the water pollution, the ocean dead zone, soil pollution, and so on and so forth. And there have been a number of, again, a very prominent messages in the form of documentaries and books. So for example, if we look at the ethical threat, very, very good undercover footage by PETA, by Mercy for Animals, by Canadians for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, who've done some very, very important work. There are the, well-known documentaries Earthlings and Dominion, which have done a very good job of raising our consciousness. I actually show the latter one in class, and it does the trick almost every single time. There are students who watch this and then they can't do it anymore. They'll send me a long email saying, "Professor, I can't eat meat anymore. I've been haunted by what I've seen in this documentary." Others like The Ghosts in Our Machine, Seaspiracy, books like Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, and Every 12 Seconds by Timothy Pachaurod. These are books which have done a very good job of educating the public about the horrors of animal agriculture. And so then there's the biomedical threat, which has been expressed through books captured in books like The China Study by Colin Campbell, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease by Caldwell Esselstyn, And then there's the environmentalist threat, which has been captured in numerous reports and articles that we read about every single day. But these go back as far as 20 years ago. Over, every few years, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization will put out a report about the horrific effects of animal agriculture on the climate. So this is one of their most prominent reports, called Tackling Climate Change Through Livestock: A Global Assessment of Emissions and Mitigation Opportunities. And then another one by Greenpeace about how livestock contributes more to climate change than all cars, trucks, planes, trains, and ships on Earth combined. Okay, so there are two things at stake here. One is that, yes, all of these three different threats, the ethical threat, the biomedical threat, and the environmentalist threat, all of this messaging is changing people's dietary habits. And of course, this is a profit-based industry, so money is at stake, profits are at stake. So they're deeply concerned about that. They're also concerned about the unraveling of an entire metaphysical worldview that puts human beings at the top and then non-human beings at the bottom. And this is the kind of moral system on which the entire edifice of animal agriculture and indeed capitalism in general is based. And so one of the points that I make in the book is that animal liberation challenges the entire worldview on which the meat industry capitalism and capitalism generally are based. Okay, so one of the ways that the meat industry responds to this is by producing a kind of reactionary and conservative rhetoric. One of the people who has written about this the most eloquently is Corey Robin, a political scientist in New York, in his book, The Reactionary Mind, subtitled Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump. It's a very good book that I highly recommend. And so in the book, he tries to answer this kind of really puzzling question: what is conservatism? Because it's actually not an easy term to define. And so what he says is that conservatism is a reaction to revolutionary movements for equality and social justice, and that at its core, conservatism is the preservation of hierarchy. So what types of hierarchy? Conservatism is devoted to the preservation of patriarchy, of men over women, of a class structure of rich over poor, of a racial structure of white over non-white, of an imperial structure of colonizer over colonized, straight over queer, industry over environment. It comes to the defense of every single one of these hierarchical relationships. And if you look at histories of revolutionary movements for equality and social justice, every single time you're going to find an attempt to discredit these movements. So in response, for example, to the abolition movement, there were defenses. There were defenses of slavery by invoking the Bible. And oftentimes they would make slave owners out to be victims, right? And they would appeal to theology in order to argue that this is just a kind of natural order, and how dare you try to undo what has been sanctioned by the Bible. This happened in the case of feminism as well. This is Mary Wollstonecraft in her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She put forth an argument for gender equality. And this was met with a certain kind of derision on the part of people who had something to protect from patriarchal types. So there was this one Professor Thomas Taylor who published this book with a very sarcastic title, A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. And the idea was, okay, today women are calling for rights between men and women. The next thing you know, if we follow this crazy logic, then before you know it, people will be calling for the rights of animals. And how insane would that be, right? In response to the civil rights movement, where all they were calling for was, voting, equality when it comes to voting rights, desegregated schools and jobs. same thing. There was derision. There was just this kind of vicious dismissal of a call for equality and human dignity. And the same thing can be found in the gay liberation movement and the fight for marriage equality. It is portrayed as, an outrage, something that is extreme, and that it's a threat to innocent people. It's a threat to heterosexual marriage. It's a threat to children. And then lastly, we can see the same thing in the movement for the climate. The environmental movement has been labeled as communist. One of Donald Trump's cabinet members likened global warming. He called global warming a form of Marxist ideology, and basically said that if you are somebody who is a climate change activist, you're basically some sort of raving Marxist or Maoist or Stalinist, right? Every single time, it's an attempt to take activists who are trying to do good and frame them as crazy and extremist, right? So again, these are the different forms of hierarchy. We can add to that the hierarchy of the human over the non-human. This is one more way that conservatism inserts itself and tries to preserve a hierarchical power relationship. And if you want to read a very good book about that, it's called The Great Chain of Being by Arthur Lovejoy. And the basic idea here is that it's a history of the exploration of this idea of a kind of eternal structure to the cosmos. And at the top of it is God, and then there are angels, and then there are humans, and then below humans are animals and plants and stones and so forth. And it's amazing how we've undone hierarchy in so many different forms, but for some reason, even many progressive people, when it comes to animals, and when it comes to meat, for some reason they veer towards the right, and they start defending a very old-fashioned kind of hierarchy. They just become conservative about it. So this is the point about veganism and animal liberation. It threatens the very idea of the great chain of being. So it's more than just profits. Again, an entire worldview is at stake, and that's why they react to it so vehemently and so aggressively. Okay, so these reactions, like either memes that are just meant to kind of pour scorn upon vegans and animal rights activists, or more ostensibly serious messaging like this, which tries to put plant-based products in a bad light. These are both two different forms of that kind of reactionary rhetoric. They're two different forms of what I would call meatsplaining. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about, as a very interesting kind of phenomenon, the grass-fed beef movement, because this is, in my view, one of the most effective, insidious, and fascinating case studies in meatsplaining. And so I spend a great deal of time in the book towards the end talking about the kind of the rhetoric and the fantasy that has been built up around grass-fed meat. Bree, how are we doing for time?
We're good, Jason. We're 25 minutes in.
Oh, okay, good. Perfect. So the kind of, how should I say this, hype about grass-fed beef has been with us for a very, very long time. Just a kind of embarrassing anecdote. I used to be a grass-fed beef person back in the day. I used to go to, I think it was called Bread and Circus when I was living in Boston, and I insisted on having, buying all organic, grass-fed, free-range, hormone-free meat and all that kind of thing, because I believed it was healthier and so on and so forth, right? And that was a big kind of popular idea when I first got into this sort of thing, that it was a superior kind of meat. The other kind of meat is just, it's all filled with, hormones and chemicals and so forth. So if you eat the grass-fed stuff, you're good. It's good for your body, good for the animals. I don't know how I could have thought that, but and then it's also good for the environment, right? And so this was the kind of the main sort of appeal behind the idea of grass-fed beef for the longest time. But then more recently, as a result of things like the UN report, as well as reports coming out of Brazil, where we're reading about on a daily basis the raising of the Amazon to the ground for the purpose of making space to raise cattle in order to serve, bring more meat, more beef onto the market for markets in Europe and China. We're seeing, to our great horror, the Amazon, this wonder of the world, this natural wonder of the world, being sadly, horrifically, tragically burned for steaks and for burgers. It's really, really heartbreaking to see. But it's also created an enormous PR crisis for the animal agriculture industry. And so they've kind of moved into crisis mode in order to grapple with this PR disaster and to rebrand themselves in such a way as to essentially protect their profits by creating this new image of themselves as somehow green, as somehow sustainable and eco-friendly. So there are a number of people who are responsible for this sort of thing. One of them is Joel Salatin. He's very, very popular among the slow food movement, among the natural organic meats kind of farming culture. He's somebody who runs something called Polyface Farms, or Polyface Farm in Virginia. He's written a number of books, been in a lot of documentaries, very prominent public speaker, very huge proponent of kind of doing things the natural way, the traditional way, and returning to the earth and to the soil, and raising animals the way they were supposedly supposed to be raised, right? He's very heavily promoted by this guy, Michael Pollan, who is also the author of a number of books. And again, another very big proponent of the whole kind of grass-fed meat ideal and returning to slow foods and natural foods, right? Natural pork, natural beef, natural chicken, and so on and so forth. And both of these guys, by the way, are very, very dismissive, and they have their own kind of, meatsplaining against veganism and animal rights. They are extremely condescending. Pollan writes about the animal people like we are, irrational and so forth. Very condescending and very dismissive. And you can find both of their, voices and their basic message in this very well-known documentary known as Food Inc., which is rightly, justifiably critical of factory farming, but then in its place, advocates basically these grass-fed farms and so forth. But probably the one voice who has made the most kind of extreme statement in defense of grass-fed beef, the one voice who's made the most extreme claims on behalf of grass-fed beef is this guy, the Zimbabwean farmer, Alan Savory. He's got a TED Talk that he did in 2013, in which he actually argues that grass-fed beef can save us from climate change. This is the most extreme claim out there, and unfortunately, it's kind of taken the farming community by storm. He says in his talk, he says, we can take enough carbon out of the atmosphere and safely store it in the grassland soils for thousands of years. And if we do just that on about half the world's grasslands, we can take us back to pre-industrial levels while feeding people at the same time. This is the idea here. If you feed a cow grass, then it will nourish the cow's stomach, and the cow has this kind of magical 4-chamber stomach. They have an almost religious belief in the power of the fermentation process in a cow's stomach to break down and ferment the grass. And then what happens is they end up pooping out this basically this magical poop, which they trample into the ground. It nourishes the soil. The grass returns. The grass will suck carbon out of the air, and it will become this kind of basically massive carbon sink. And all we need to do is to spread this model all over the earth, and we will end up sucking all of that carbon out of the air back into the soil, right? Interestingly enough, they basically overlook the production of methane through this process, which we know is a very, very dangerous greenhouse gas. They actually completely downplay it. They will minimize and trivialize its effect on the environment. They will say things like methane has a very short shelf life, therefore we don't need to worry about it. What we really need to worry about is carbon. Therefore, let's go ahead and farm as many of these animals as possible and just follow this regenerative grazing or holistic grazing method. And that way we will reverse climate change. And so this is, as I say in the book, this is a form of magical thinking because it's unsupported by the science. There is some evidence to suggest that yes, this method can absorb some carbon for a limited amount of time in some of the soil, but the idea that it can reverse climate change to pre-industrial levels is scientifically baseless. There was an extremely good critique of this entire argument by Tara Garnett and her team at Oxford in this report called Grazed and Confused by the Food Climate Research Network that looked at this claim in meticulous detail and came to the conclusion that it's completely false. There are marginal benefits from grass-fed farming, but the idea that this is a solution to climate change is extremely dangerous. But unfortunately, this report and subsequent reports have not done anything to phase the movement. The idea that grass-fed beef can, is our solution to climate change, again, has taken that community by storm, the animal farming community by storm, and it's become a very popular idea to the point where it started out with just the small farmers, right? But now it's been adopted by these mega corporations like General Mills, for example. They've recognized the kind of the social responsibility value of getting on board the regenerative grazing bandwagon. So they are proponents of regenerative grazing. So if you look at their website, they will show you all these, fancy charts, and they have all these details about how by the time it's 2030, they plan to basically, convert, millions of acres to this regenerative grazing model. Cargill jumped on board with this as well. If you look at their website, they've made similar statements and pledges that they plan by 2030 again to practice regenerative grazing across 1 million acres. I don't see this as anything other than a desperate PR move, a way of reinventing yourself in the age of climate change to show that we're not the enemy. We're with you. We want to work with you. We want to be part of the solution, right? And this is just a way of kind of dodging the actual ecological consequences of animal agriculture. And then the other thing about this movement, this grass-fed beef movement, is that it is predicated upon a very, very silent yet insidious and dangerous erasure of history. Because these farms, even though they're kind of designed to be presented as really kind of benign and environmentally friendly, and they're friends of the earth, and we're returning to nature and tradition and so on and so forth, what's missing from this nice narrative, this nice story about old-fashioned farmers, is that they're practicing these forms of agriculture. They're practicing it all on stolen land, right? And that's never ever mentioned when they talk about returning to the soil and being good to the earth and so forth. They're not mentioning that they're doing this on other people's land. And so one thing that's missing from the stories of happy cows and happy pigs and so forth, and these are wonderful animals. They're really genuinely beautiful, innocent, loving, animals with really complex emotions and so forth. But what they won't tell you, what they won't ever acknowledge, is that cows and pigs are not native to the Americas. These animals were forcibly brought here by Europeans, subjected to a foreign, an alien, colonial form of agriculture, which was used to drive out indigenous peoples from their traditional homelands. And this was done both through, a vigilante, through vigilante operations and with the sanctions and blessings of government policy. As a way for farmers to make money, they struck up deals with local governments, who then arranged for the expulsion of indigenous peoples from their land so that they could raise and grow livestock. If you want to read a book about this, about the role that cows and pigs played in the geographical transformation of the Americas, it's called Creatures of Empire by Virginia Anderson. A very, very good book about the role that that animal farming played in ethnic cleansing. There's nothing benign about it at all. And this is, again, completely erased from these nice, happy stories that you get about, grass-fed beef and free range this and hormone-free that, right? Essentially, what we're seeing right now in Brazil, this is an image from Brazil of a rancher. Ranching is basically taking over the Amazon. The Amazon is being deforested by mining, by loggers, but primarily by ranchers to make room for cattle, to make room for livestock. What we're seeing in Brazil, this horrible, horrible story, is already what already happened in North America. But we've completely forgotten that. We've forgotten that history. And we act like cows and pigs have always been on North American soil when they haven't. So that's part of why I say that meatsplaining is a new name for an old devil, because this mythology about the land and about the soil, this goes back hundreds of years. This is not something new. It's been so effective that, again, we've forgotten what this land was even like before the image that we're looking at right now. In some parts of the US, they don't even hide it. They have bumper stickers where they're completely open about this. So this is a bumper sticker from somewhere in the American Southwest where they say, eat beef. The West wasn't won on salad, right? Now this is, they're not going to call this colonialism. This is basically a cowboys and Indians view of history, that we cowboys, we acquired this land by battling, the Indians or whatever. It's this kind of really sort of cartoonish version of history, but it's an indirect testament to the role that ranching played in, the genocidal, impact, the genocidal spread of animal agriculture across the American West. So that's one of the points that I am working on in my new book, New White Saviors, about the role of animal agriculture as an instrument of ethnic cleansing in the Americas. And then the last point that I wanted to make about the free-range grass-fed movement is the relationship between that movement and a kind of intrinsic racism that's partly from the denial of history, but which gets perpetuated in attitudes and practices to this very day. So there's a good expose about this sort of thing by Mother Jones about Joel Salatin, who, if you watch that documentary, Food Inc., again, you get the idea that he's just a good old-fashioned guy who cares about the animals and the earth and about his customers, and giving people healthy and nutritious food. And what's completely missing from that nice and happy story is the fact that this man is a really kind of horrible and insatiable racist, and that this racism goes hand in hand with his libertarian worldview. Incidentally, it's really bizarre. It's really bizarre for grass-fed farmers to kind of prop this guy up as a climate savior, because he denies climate change. So why the excitement about grass-fed beef as a solution to climate change when he doesn't even believe it? But if you look at his libertarian views, it includes not just a rejection of climate change. It also includes some really horribly racist attitudes. So the article has these two quotes by Salatin, where he says, "I would suggest that the BIPOC folks who feel America offers them no opportunity should give up all modern conveniences and return to their tribal locations and domicile." He goes on to say, "The fact is that historically, people out of the fort did receive arrows. That is not racist. It is a fact of history and works as well as an instructive metaphor about leadership savvy." That's his justification basically for ethnic cleansing. Okay, and so do your own kind of experiment and look up images of these grass-fed farmers, and you will find that you will see basically that the faces of this community are whiter than the whole organic milk that they sell, right? There's a reason for it, is because there's a racism bound up in their entire tradition. So when we look at a steak, if there's one message that I want to convey, it's that, yes, this is, this represents violence against animals. This represents, a threat to public health. It represents a threat to the environment, but there's also a colonial legacy and a colonial politics bound up with this food that everyone takes for granted as just part of, an all Canadian or all American diet, right? There's a very kind of serious and ugly and sordid colonial history that is bound up with this food. And so I think that there's no separation between racism and environmental destruction. They're both violently intertwined. And so this fantasy about grass-fed beef is one of these kinds of, case studies in meatsplaining that I'm going to be exploring in my book, New White Saviors. So that is actually all that I have, and looks like 7:45, so good enough amount of time for questions and answers.
Yes, thank you, Jason. I loved that. That was so fascinating and has led to a lot of interesting discussion in the comments as well. So it seems like people are really enjoying this. I want to remind everyone quickly that we're going to be posting this talk on our Facebook and YouTube and our website. So you'll be able to refer back to all of these excellent sources that Jason has provided. But we do have a lot of questions and we have about 15 minutes to get to them. So let's jump right in. Why don't we start off with, can you speak to the way that this rhetoric is ingrained in us? For example, I think of the ways that people repeat these kinds of meatsplaining ideas and messages. How do we prevent people, especially youth, from internalizing this messaging while growing up and living in a speciesist world?
I think by learning from the example of feminism. One of the, I think, the great gifts that feminism has given us is to raise our consciousness about our practices of communication, about our language and our speech, and making us more conscious of our own words and the way that we interact with each other, both explicitly and implicitly, to the point where we now have, I think, an effective and growing public consciousness and awareness about really horribly condescending patriarchal attitudes that manifest themselves in the form of everyday speech, to the point where when someone now mansplains, it's become a very powerful move to kind of counter that form of condescension by saying, look, you're mansplaining, just stop it, right? There was a really, really wonderful video, a clip from a parliamentary session in Australia where a female politician was speaking, and then she got interrupted or talked down to by a male colleague who was just being the most kind of, condescending person possible. And rather than sort of responding to his points, head on, she just kind of took a step back and called him out on his BS and said, I really, I'm enjoying the mansplaining that's going on here. And he got all defensive and, he was really unsettled and he go, what are you talking about, right? And what she was doing was she was tapping into this powerful term, again, that Rebecca Solnit has injected into our public consciousness. And she gave us a tool for challenging patriarchal speech. I think we need to do something similar when it comes to meatsplaining. I think that what we should do is try to cultivate a public awareness and consciousness about this form of condescension. That if you speak up for animals, if you try to point out the link between the animal agriculture industry and violence against animals, or public health consequences or environmental consequences, or even indeed again about the racism about within the farming culture, that if the reaction is one of condescension, or they'll come at you with facts or statistics, or so and so says blah 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 blah, not to play their game. Don't play their game. Step out of it. Be like, look, you're doing it. You're meatsplaining. Just stop. I'm not interested in playing that stupid game, right? I think part of what we can do, what I would like to see happen, is for us to cultivate that second order awareness of our practices of speech, to be able to see things from the outside and call out the BS when we see it happening right before our very eyes.
Yeah, that's a really good point about just having awareness of that this is something that happens, and learning from how this has happened in other types of inequalities in the past.
Yeah.
That starts to answer another question that we have, which is, do you know of strategies we can use to effectively counter the meatsplaining rhetoric? And I think related to that is another question that asks, is the rhetoric of the meat industry intentionally misleading, or do you think the meatsplainers are deluded, or some combination of both? And does that make a difference to how we respond to them?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be a bit of both. I mean, I think if we're talking about a PR executive, right, from JBS or from Cargill or from Manitoba Pork, I don't think it's unintentional. I think everything that they do is going to be very, very conscious and deliberate. The Marxist in me is inclined to say that there will be kind of, how should I say this, rank and file carnivores who have internalized a lot of these talking points and do take them very seriously, and may be, extremely sincere in their, dismissal. But then I would say that there are many people who have, internalized a patriarchal, attitude, and who are very sincere in their patriarchy, just like there are many people who are sincere in their racism. I'm not terribly inclined to be sympathetic or understanding of a sexist or a racist. Maybe there's some room for just trying to be a little bit more understanding with somebody who really believes these sorts of myths about the meat industry, and maybe we can exercise a little bit more patience and try to educate them and so forth. I think it has to be a two-pronged strategy. For somebody like that, okay, maybe fine, be a little bit more understanding. When it comes to PR executives, there's no excuse. They know exactly what they're doing. Their job is to basically manufacture consent. So.
Yeah, what about farmers? We have a question here about, do farmers actually think that their products are healthy and necessary for humans, or are they also just peddling a product?
I think that we'd have to take on a case-by-case basis. I mean, it's tricky because there is a livelihood at stake, right? So the extent to which a material kind of base will influence your ideological worldview is, I think, something that we should think about, whether it's their the need to protect their livelihood that shapes their thinking, or if they genuinely believe this, whether it's rooted in their livelihood or not. That's a matter for psychology. I don't know that we can really say. Some seem like they're really sincere. Others have been some of the most kind of harshest and condescending meatsplainers that I've ever encountered, especially here in Manitoba. They can be really, really, really obnoxious. We get a lot of trolls on vegan pages, on the Veg Fest page. The Winnipeg Humane Society gets lots of these people where you say all you have to do is post a vegan recipe, and then you can get a lot of them just kind of flooding your page with condescension and derision, right? So I guess it's partly a matter of the attitude. If they enter into the discussion with at least some semblance of civility, that's one thing. But it's when they're so sarcastic and rude and condescending that I think just kind of betrays their actual intentions, right?
Yeah, it's so complicated to understand sometimes. You mentioned how veganism challenges our worldview, and that conservatism is often a reaction to movements that challenge hierarchies or worldviews. And we have a couple of questions related to that. One is, do you think it's inconsistent to be politically conservative and an animal rights activist? And along similar lines, in order to convince a conservative to go vegan, is it necessary to draw them away from conservatism first, or is there a way to work around that?
I mean, I know people who call themselves conservatives and who identify as vegans. And I think that is, I don't know how they're able to maintain that what I would describe as a contradictory worldview. So I know people who, for example, they're vegans and they voted for Donald Trump, even as he shredded environmental policies and environmental protections for animals, and removed regulations from the meat industry. I don't know how you maintain those two stances, right? What I would encourage is to read about the history of conservatism. Conservatism originated in post-Regency England as a reaction to democracy, to the movement for equality. Edmund Burke was somebody who believed very much in hierarchy. He was a racist. He was a misogynist. He was somebody who attacked feminism and Mary Wollstonecraft. The preservation of hierarchy is constitutive of what it means to be conservative. There are people who may sincerely believe that conservatism is, the free market, or that it's, freedom and liberty and family values and whatever, but those are all just talking points. At the end of the day, it's about the preservation of hierarchy. And there are many, many good books about this. If you want to read a really good one, it's called Poisoning the Minds of the Lower Orders by Don Herzog, which is about the reaction to the movement for democracy within 19th century England. So I would say that's probably the best place to start, is by reading about the history. And once you do, it becomes clear, like, which, you can't be for animal rights, but then, against women's rights, or for animal rights, but then against, Black Lives Matter. Sorry, but these are contradictory positions. You're either for equality across the board, or you're selective. And if you're selective, then there's some hypocrisy going on there.
That's really good advice to check out those resources, and a really valuable perspective too. Thank you for sharing that. Switching gears a little bit, I was really happy that you brought up the grass-fed meat discussion, because that's something that gets brought up to me a lot, and it seems like a lot of people in the comments related to that as well. So we have a question about you, and you mentioned that even you were taken in by the grass-fed beef rhetoric, and curious about what you found so appealing about that and what eventually made you change your perspective.
Yeah, so it was a health thing for me at first. I mean, I had, read the stories and heard public talks about how conventional livestock are fed all of these chemicals, and I didn't want chemicals in my body. And so I had this idea that, natural is good. And that's what did it for me initially. But then that same kind of concern about my health is what led me to read about the link between animal foods and heart disease and cancer and so forth. And I should say initially I was just plant-based. I didn't call myself vegan. I resisted that temptation, but that lasted for about 3 days, and then I'm just like, okay, no, F it, I'm vegan all the way. And so it just kind of, you can come at it from different angles, but it's like, it's never one moment where the entire worldview switches. It kind of shifts, over time. In my case, it was about, a few days or whatever, but it started out with a concern for health, and then it became like an ethical concern, and then an environmental concern. And then by the time it was done, I was just, 180-degree switch to a completely different person.
Happy to have you on our side. Let's end off with one final question. It is, how can we convince people that animal rights are important? I know a lot of people who care deeply about human equality and addressing those hierarchies that you mentioned in your talk, but they still eat meat because they don't see animals as having the same rights as humans.
It partly depends on the person. I have my class, the Rhetoric of Animality, which I'm going to be teaching in the fall. And so it's a 3-month class of basically trying to undo that hierarchical worldview. We start with books. We start with J.M. Coetzee's The Lives of Animals. We read essays. We read about the history of colonialism. We read about the political economy of factory farms. I have to chip away at it bit by bit by bit by bit. And I end the term by assigning dominion. And basically I say, if you don't want to do one of the readings, you can watch the documentary and then do a report on that. And of course, it's the end of the term and they're tired of doing all the reading. So they leap at the chance to watch the documentary, and then they're just kind of traumatized by what they see. And it does a very good job of changing people's minds. For some people, it may be too gory, so you might have to give them a book. You might have to give them Timothy Pacharat's Every 12 Seconds, which is, or this other book that came out recently called Porkopolis. You may have to talk to them about history. You may have to say, okay, look, at one point, people were resistant to women's rights. At one point, people were resistant to civil rights. At one point, people were resistant to civil rights. This is the exact same kind of resistance. It's no different in form. So if we want to be consistent, we should embrace animal rights as well, and see animal rights as part of this continuum, this fight for equality, this general fight for undoing hierarchy. So it depends on the person. You kind of have to get a feel and understanding for who they are, take it on a case-by-case basis, and then, practice your powers of rhetoric and do what you can to educate them in the best way about the struggle for animals and the struggle for the planet.
That's a great answer. And I love that idea of meeting people where they are and providing them with the reasons that'll be most compelling to them and the resources that are most suitable for them to take in as well. That's really important. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you so much. That was fascinating and very informative. And we really appreciate you taking the time. Can you tell people where they should go to follow you and learn more about your upcoming work?
Yeah, sure. So I don't have any, well, I have my personal Facebook page. If you want to add me, go ahead. I'll be happy to add you. I'm on LinkedIn. I do run Winnipeg Veg Fest. So you can follow us there on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do our event, our big festival this year because of COVID-19, which is really sad and heartbreaking. So it's now 2 years in a row that it's been canceled. But yeah, my personal page is on Facebook and LinkedIn, and then my VegFest pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you everyone who tuned in and asked questions. Please keep an eye out on our social media accounts as well at EarthSafe Canada for details about the next speaker in our series, which will be coming up in October. And thanks again, Jason, and thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks so much.